On a cold morning when the smoke of revolution still hung over a newborn nation, America faced a question the world had asked 1,000 times and answered the same way every time. Who will wear the crown now? Empires did not believe in happy endings without kings. Courts in London, Paris, and Madrid watched the former colonies like hawks, waiting for the American experiment to collapse into the one familiar shape history always took: one strong man rising from the chaos, one general turning victory into permanent power, one hero deciding that liberty was too fragile to be trusted to ordinary people. They expected a Caesar. They expected a Cromwell. They expected, at best, a new monarch with a different accent. And in a sense they were right to expect it, because the temptation was real, the mechanism was ready, and the need for order was desperate. The truly bombastic, astonishing, pride-making truth, the part Americans should never forget, is that the man who stood at the center of that temptation refused it so completely that he changed what the world thought was possible. George Washington did not merely win independence. He proved that power could be surrendered. He proved that a victorious commander could go home. He proved that the armed might of a revolution could kneel to civilian law. He proved that a nation could be founded not on a throne, but on restraint. And that refusal, more than any battle, was the moment the United States became something new on the earth. To understand why Washington's refusal to be king mattered so much, you have to picture the 18th century as it really was, not as a museum exhibit with quiet music behind glass. The old world ran on hierarchy and inheritance. Authority flowed downward. Soldiers swore loyalty to monarchs, not documents. Governments were commonly understood as the property of dynasties, and when dynasties changed, it was rarely because the people voted. It was because armies moved. Even revolutions, when they happened, often ended with a new strongman claiming that only he could protect the gains of the uprising. The idea that a revolution would end with a general voluntarily handing power back to a civilian government and then walking away into private life was so rare it sounded like a myth. Yet Washington did it not once but repeatedly, like a man determined to teach his country a lesson about itself, that America would not be a nation of rulers and subjects, but a nation of citizens, and that citizens must never confuse admiration for a leader with permission to be ruled by him forever. Washington's story begins far from the marble monuments and heroic paintings. Born in Virginia in 1732 at Bridges Creek, he entered a society where your birth shaped your ceiling, where land meant independence, and where reputation was a kind of invisible armor. He was the eldest of 6 children from his father's second wife, and he had 4 older half-siblings from his father's first marriage, which meant that from the start he lived inside the complexities of family rank, inheritance, and social expectation. When he was 11 years old, his father died, and in colonial America that kind of loss could turn a child's future into uncertainty. Education, connections, property, and guidance could all vanish. Washington became the ward of his half-brother Lawrence and Lawrence's wife, and people with position, experience, and access to the social world that mattered. This detail can sound small, almost domestic, but it shaped the man. Washington learned early that life is not guaranteed, that responsibility can arrive before you feel ready, and that steadiness in the face of change is not a luxury but a necessity. By the time Washington was 20, Lawrence and Anne had died, and Washington inherited Mount Vernon, the estate that would become his anchor and his refuge. It is easy to imagine Mount Vernon as a static backdrop to history, but for Washington it was proof that a life could be built through work, patience, and planning. He became a respected farmer and businessman, and developed a reputation for integrity through service in local community affairs. In those years, he was not yet the mythic figure of the Revolution. He was a young man learning how to manage people, solve disputes, make long-term decisions, and maintain trust. That reputation for integrity, earned over time rather than declared in slogans, would later become one of his most powerful assets, because in a revolution words are cheap, promises are plentiful, and the country's survival depends on a few people whose character is real enough to be believed. Washington's first major entrance onto the larger stage came through the French and Indian War, which was, in many ways, the rehearsal for the Revolution. In 1753, he was made a major in the Virginia militia and given a mission that was as politically delicate as it was physically dangerous: to warn the French to withdraw from territory in the Ohio Valley, where they were encroaching on the British colonies. The assignment required travel through wilderness and winter, through uncertain territory where alliances and hostilities could shift quickly, and where a lone party could disappear without leaving even a rumor. Washington succeeded in delivering the warning despite significant obstacles, and the accomplishment brought him notice and promotion to lieutenant colonel at only 22. This was not just a young man rising quickly. It was a young man learning what it feels like to carry the fate of others on his judgment, and to make decisions when waiting for instructions is impossible. The following year brought the kind of experience that separates confidence from wisdom. Washington marched with his regiment to engage French forces allied with Indian warriors, and despite some early successes, he was overwhelmed and forced to surrender in the first major encounter of the French and Indian War. That surrender matters because it shattered any illusion that courage alone guarantees triumph. Washington learned in the hardest way that the enemy gets a vote, that plans collapse, that the world does not bend to your will because you want it to. Some leaders spend their lives avoiding the humiliation of failure, and in doing so they avoid the education failure provides. Washington endured it young. Later, when the Revolution produced defeats that might have broken a lesser man's spirit or tempted him into despairing cruelty, Washington had already learned how to absorb disaster without surrendering his purpose. Washington later joined the staff of General Braddock, whose forces suffered catastrophic defeat near Fort Duquesne. The defeat was the kind that turns an organized army into a panicked crowd and reveals who has true composure when authority and order dissolve. In the chaos, Washington's courage and calm demeanor were instrumental in saving the expedition from complete annihilation, and he led the remnants out of action. Almost miraculously, he was one of the few unwounded officers. People love the romance of bulletproof legends, but the more important point is psychological. Washington's steadiness under fire became part of his identity to the people around him. When men are terrified, they look for someone who seems unafraid not because he is reckless, but because he is focused. Washington had that quality. It would later keep soldiers in line, keep Congress from panicking, and keep the public from losing faith when the cause looked doomed. Returning to Virginia, Washington was appointed commander-in-chief of the colony's defense forces and charged with defending the frontier against Indian and French incursions. It was not glamorous command. It was logistics, supply shortages, distant forts, angry settlers, political interference, and the endless grind of doing too much with too little. It taught him how fragile a military operation is without consistent funding and a cooperative civilian government. It taught him the bitterness of watching men suffer because officials far away cannot agree on resources. These frustrations would return during the Revolution on a national scale, when Washington's army often lacked food, clothing, ammunition, and pay. The difference is that by then, Washington had already developed the patience to endure the impossible without collapsing into rage or resignation. At the conclusion of hostilities, Washington resigned his commission. That decision, which might seem routine on paper, was actually a preview of the pattern that would later stun the world. He returned to Mount Vernon and married Martha Custis in January 1759, gaining 2 stepchildren and considerable wealth. Over the next 15 years, he proved himself a successful entrepreneur and gentleman farmer and became one of the richest men in the colonies. He also devoted time to local politics. In other words, he had everything a man of his class could want: land, standing, family, wealth, influence. This matters because it shows that Washington did not become a revolutionary because he had nothing to lose. He had enormous stakes in stability. He chose resistance not because it was convenient, but because he came to believe it was right, and because he believed that rights without courage are just words. As the crisis with Britain deepened, Washington's national role grew. He took a principled stance for freedom from British rule and became a delegate to both the First and Second Continental Congresses. He involved himself in organizing troop volunteers and equipment for what he increasingly saw as inevitable conflict. By the time war came, Washington had become known as a man who could be trusted with responsibility, a man who could work with others, and a man whose personal ambition did not swallow the cause. When the War of Independence broke out in 1775, he was chosen as commander-in-chief. The choice was not merely about military skill, it was about political unity. The colonies were separate societies with their own rivalries. Choosing a Virginian helped bind the southern colonies to the struggle centered in New England. Choosing Washington, respected, steady, and already known for discipline, also signaled that the rebellion would not be a mob but an organized resistance. Washington accepted the command in a spirit that became central to his legend. He refused any salary and declared that he did not believe he was qualified, accepting only because the request had been unanimous. In a world where men often grasp for titles, he accepted a burden. In a world where many leaders exaggerate their ability, he admitted the weight of the task. This was not weakness, it was moral seriousness. Washington understood that command is not theater. It is responsibility for lives, for outcomes, for history. And he understood, too, that if the revolution succeeded, the greatest danger might not be the British, but what Americans might do with victory. Following the British evacuation of Boston in 1776, Americans proclaimed the Declaration of Independence. Yet the war continued, and Washington's army faced repeated trials. The revolution was not a constant upward march. It was an exhausting series of setbacks, retreats, and desperate improvisations. Washington often commanded a force that was outtrained, undersupplied, and outmatched by the British regulars. The weather could be as deadly as the enemy. Morale could collapse without warning. And through it all, Washington had to do something few people appreciate. He had to keep the cause alive in the minds of civilians. Armies can fight only as long as societies believe the fight is worth it. The greatest battlefield is often the public's patience, and Washington's leadership was partly the art of buying time. Time for alliances, time for training, time for the British to tire, time for American institutions to take root. Valley Forge at the end of 1777 became a symbol because it concentrated the war's suffering into one unforgettable image. Ragged men in freezing conditions, shortages of food and supplies, disease spreading through camp, and the gnawing question of whether the dream of independence was worth this price. Washington's genius there was not merely strategic, it was spiritual in the civic sense. He inspired perseverance not by pretending the suffering wasn't real, but by embodying the belief that surrender would make all suffering meaningless. He insisted that the army endure, that it train, that it become more disciplined, that it hold together. The point was not simply to survive winter. The point was to survive doubt. And by surviving doubt, Washington helped teach Americans a national habit, that hardship can be faced without yielding the future. The article describes Washington's leadership as courageous, dogged, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat, and that captures an essential truth. But there is another trait that sits quietly behind the more dramatic words: restraint. Washington had power over armed men. He could have used that power to silence critics, to intimidate politicians, to punish dissent. He did not. He argued with Congress, pleaded, pressured, demanded better support, and expressed frustration, but he did not treat civilian government as a nuisance to be swept aside. In doing so, he prevented the revolution from becoming what revolutions often become: a military regime justified by emergency. He kept alive the principle that the army served the people, not the other way around. That principle later made his refusal to be king believable, because it was not a single dramatic choice. It was the consistent pattern of his character. When the War of Independence ended in 1783, Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. This moment is often described in reverent terms, but consider it in human terms too. He had spent years under enormous pressure, carrying blame for defeats and receiving little credit for survival, hearing rumors and complaints, watching men die, and knowing that his own failure could doom the entire cause. He could have argued that the country owed him more than thanks. He could have insisted on a permanent role, a lifelong command, a special office. The public would likely have accepted it. Many would have celebrated it, but he walked away. To Americans, that choice should feel like a kind of national inheritance, proof that from the beginning, the country's best moments were built not only by bold action, but by voluntary limits on power. Yet independence did not automatically produce effective government. The young United States struggled under the Articles of Confederation, a framework too weak to manage national finances, coordinate policy, or respond to unrest. Without a strong union, the nation risked unraveling into competing states, vulnerable to foreign influence and internal dispute. Washington, even in retirement, worked for a stronger union of states under one federal head, not because he wanted a monarchy, but because he understood that liberty without cohesion is fragile. This is one of the paradoxes at the heart of Washington's legacy. He wanted a government strong enough to survive, but not so strong it could become tyranny, and he believed that the best protection against tyranny was not a crown, but a constitutional structure supported by civic virtue. In 1786, a convention in Annapolis was called to amend the Articles of Confederation, but there was insufficient support to establish a quorum. The failure was a warning flare. It suggested that the states might not even be capable of gathering seriously to solve their shared problems. That failure led to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. Washington was chosen as president of the convention, and his presence brought legitimacy. The delegates were divided into factions, suspicious of each other, and anxious about surrendering state power to a central authority. Washington's reputation made it harder for cynics to claim the convention was merely a power grab. He stood there not as a schemer, but as a symbol of sacrifice and credibility, and that symbol mattered because political systems do not rest only on laws. They rest on trust, and trust often rests on the character of a few key figures during founding moments. The Philadelphia Convention ultimately produced the United States Constitution, abandoning the Articles of Confederation in favor of a stronger federal system. It is fashionable to think the Constitution was destined, but it was not. It emerged from conflict, compromise, and the fear that the Republic might fail before it truly began. Washington did not write the Constitution himself, but his role was central. He was the one man respected by opposing factions, the one man whose commitment to Republican government could be believed. That belief mattered when the country later decided who should be the first president. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected to the office. Unanimous. That fact alone tells you something rare. The nation saw him not as a partisan weapon, but as a unifying figure, a human bridge across divisions that might otherwise tear the fragile Union apart. Washington accepted the presidency somewhat reluctantly, returning once again to public life. He was stepping into an office with no precedent, no inherited traditions, no tested boundaries. Every gesture would teach Americans what a president was. Would he demand titles? Would he surround himself with ceremony? Would he behave like a monarch in Republican clothing? People forget how close the early republic stood to the edge of imitation. Many Americans had lived their entire lives under monarchy. The habits of monarchy were familiar. The language of monarchy crept naturally into conversation. Washington could have allowed those habits to shape the new government. Instead, he practiced a deliberate simplicity. He helped build the executive branch as a necessary instrument of governance, not as a personal court. Even when he traveled and was greeted with public admiration, he tried to keep the office from becoming a throne. 4 years later, Washington was persuaded to serve a second term because leaders around him believed he alone could continue to unite the nation. The reality of party politics had already begun to entrench itself, and Washington was deeply frustrated by it. He had hoped the country could govern itself through shared national purpose, but disagreements about finance, foreign policy, and the scope of federal power created factions that hardened into parties. Washington feared that parties would cause Americans to think of each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens. Yet he also knew that the republic could not be preserved by wishing away conflict. He had to govern within that conflict while trying to prevent it from turning into national rupture. His second term was, in many ways, an endurance test. Could the presidency remain an office of law and limits rather than a weapon of faction? By the end of his second term, Washington faced another choice that would define American political culture. Many wanted him to remain. Some believed the country was too young to risk change. Some argued that because he was trusted, he should continue indefinitely. And here is where the theme, the man who refused to be king, becomes more than a dramatic phrase. Washington understood that even if he personally had no desire to become a monarch, the habit of keeping him in power could begin to look like monarchy. If the nation decided that only one man could hold it together, then the nation had already abandoned the principle that the people and the Constitution were the true foundation. Washington refused to run for a third term. He stepped away. He returned to Mount Vernon. He chose the precedent of peaceful transfer of power, a precedent that told the world the United States was not a temporary rebellion led by a permanent strongman, but a real republic capable of replacing its leaders without violence. This is where part one must end, because the second half of the story, the most electric half, the half where the temptation of monarchy becomes explicit and the meaning of Washington's refusal becomes fully clear, belongs to part two. In part two, we will go deeper into why early Americans flirted with monarchy, what it meant that disgruntled military elements looked to Washington as a potential king, how Washington's response revealed his deepest convictions, why his voluntary surrender of power shocked Europe, and how even his death produced a salute from a former enemy. We will also tie the entire narrative to the emotional core of American pride, that the United States was born not only from victory, but from virtue, and that Washington's greatest triumph was not taking power, but leaving it behind. The most dangerous chapter of the American founding was not written at Yorktown, and it was not settled by cannons or bayonets. It was written in the quiet after victory when the adrenaline of war drained away and left behind a raw, bitter question. What happens now when the enemy is gone but the problems remain? That is the moment when revolutions often devour themselves. Soldiers return home with empty pockets and heavy memories. Legislatures argue and delay. Creditors circle. States bicker. The public grows impatient. And into that vacuum steps a familiar figure from world history, the strongman who promises order and demands obedience. In that fragile gap between war and peace, between slogans and institutions, George Washington held the one kind of power that can remake a nation overnight, the loyalty of armed men, and he refused to use it to rule. If Americans want to understand why Washington is more than a portrait on currency, they should look at this moment, because here is where the country could have become something ordinary and old, a monarchy by another name. Instead, it became something astonishing and new. When Washington stepped away from the presidency and returned to Mount Vernon, he was not simply retiring like a tired man done with public life. He was making a statement about legitimacy. He was saying that authority in America would not be personal, it would be constitutional. He was saying that the state would not be owned by its founders, it would be entrusted to its citizens. And he was saying something else that was almost shocking in the political vocabulary of his era. That leadership is not proven by how long you can hold power, but by whether your country can survive without you. The temptation to stay must have been intense, not because Washington was hungry for a throne in the medieval sense, but because he could see the dangers ahead. He could see how fragile the Union still was, how quickly it could fracture under the stress of regional rivalries and economic disputes. He could see how party politics were hardening into permanent camps. He could see how foreign powers might exploit American division. And he could have told himself, as many men throughout history have told themselves, that the Republic needed him, therefore he was justified in remaining. That is exactly how benevolent autocracy is born. A leader convinces himself that his own indispensability is proof that limits must not apply to him. Washington rejected that logic. By rejecting it, he gave the Republic a chance to grow up. The phrase, "the man who refused to be king," is often repeated as if it refers to one dramatic offer of a crown that Washington declined in a single heroic gesture. The reality is more complex and more meaningful. Washington refused kingship not once, but as a habit. He refused it in the way he behaved as commander-in-chief, refusing to treat the army as his private political club. He refused it when he resigned his commission in 1783, choosing civilian life over military authority. He refused it when he accepted the presidency as a duty rather than a coronation. He refused it in the way he avoided turning the presidency into a court. And he refused it when he stepped away after 2 terms, choosing precedent and principle over continued control. The refusal was not one isolated incident. It was the consistent discipline of a man who understood that power is easiest to take and hardest to release, and that the future of American liberty would depend on whether its greatest hero could prove that release was possible. Still, there was indeed a moment, actually several moments, when the idea of Washington as a monarch or monarch-like figure was not just a joke or an exaggeration, but a real current in the political water. To understand why, you have to look at what the country felt like in the years after the Revolution. The United States had won independence, but it had not yet secured competence. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was too weak to reliably pay debts, regulate commerce, or enforce national decisions. Congress could recommend. It could not compel. States acted like rival nations more than united partners. The same spirit of independence that had fueled resistance to Britain also fueled suspicion of any central authority. People feared that a strong government would become another tyranny, but a weak government produced another fear, that the country would dissolve into disorder. That tension between fear of tyranny and fear of chaos created a yearning for a stabilizing figure. In many societies, that yearning becomes an invitation to monarchy. The soldiers, in particular, felt betrayed. They had endured deprivation and risked death for a promise that the nation would honor them. Yet when the fighting ended, the machinery of government struggled to fulfill its obligations. Pay was delayed. Pensions were uncertain. Promises were debated by politicians who had not marched or bled. This kind of grievance is dangerous in any country because it places armed men in opposition to civilian authority, and history shows what often happens next. The army decides it will fix the government. In the United States, the most famous expression of this danger emerged in 1783, when officers at Newburgh, New York, frustrated by Congress's failure to provide pay and security, began to discuss coordinated pressure against the government. In that atmosphere, the idea circulated, explicitly or implicitly, that Washington might be the figure to lead such a movement. Some even entertained monarchy as a solution, imagining that a crowned Washington could give the nation the strength and stability it seemed to lack. Whether every officer truly wanted a king is less important than the fact that the conversation could occur at all. The mere possibility reveals how close the young republic stood to the edge of becoming a typical post-revolutionary state, where the military becomes the ultimate political authority and the hero becomes the ruler. Washington's response was decisive in the most American way possible. He did not seize the moment to elevate himself. He did not allow the army's loyalty to become leverage for his own power. Instead, he confronted the dangerous mood and redirected it toward the principles the army had supposedly fought for. He appealed to their sense of honor, their commitment to Republican ideals, and the long-term meaning of their sacrifice. He reminded them that if they turned their swords against the civil government, they would destroy the very liberty they had claimed to defend. The power of his intervention was not just that he had authority, but that he had moral credibility. The officers believed him because they had watched him suffer alongside them, refuse salary, endure criticism, and prioritize the cause over himself. In the popular retelling of the Newburgh moment, Washington's quiet humanity becomes the decisive weapon. He is said to have read a letter to the officers and then, pausing, pulled out his spectacles, remarking that he had grown gray and nearly blind in the service of his country. That small gesture, an older man acknowledging the toll of years, shifted the room. It made anger harder. It made conspiracy feel shameful. It reminded the officers that the revolution had always been about something larger than their grievances, even if their grievances were real. Whether one remembers the moment through that specific detail or not, the essence remains. Washington prevented the military from becoming the instrument of a political takeover, and he prevented himself from becoming the figurehead of a regime built on force rather than consent. This, then, is the deeper meaning of refusing to be king. It is one thing to decline a crown offered publicly in a ceremonial scene. It is another thing, more impressive, more rare, to decline the logic that produces crowns in the first place. Washington refused the logic that says the country belongs to the victorious. He refused the logic that says stability must come from a permanent ruler. He refused the logic that says ordinary citizens cannot govern themselves and must be saved from themselves by a strong hand. And he refused the logic that says the army's loyalty to a man outranks its loyalty to the nation's laws. By refusing those ideas, he gave Americans something more valuable than a victory over Britain, a political culture in which the military was expected to be subordinate to civilian rule. Even during his presidency, Washington's awareness of monarchy's gravitational pull shaped his behavior. The United States had just broken away from a king. It could not afford to look like it had simply created a new one. People argued over titles. Some wanted the president addressed with grand language that sounded suspiciously royal, because they believed the dignity of government required it. Washington resisted the slide into monarchical style. He did not live like a king, even though he could have. He did not claim an aura of untouchable grandeur, even though public admiration might have supported it. And he did something profoundly important for a new executive. He modeled restraint in the use of power, reinforcing the idea that the presidency was an office within a system, not a sovereign above it. His first inaugural address captured the philosophy behind his actions. He spoke of the magnitude and difficulty of the trust, to which the voice of his country had called him, and said it could not but overwhelm with despondence one who ought to be conscious of his own deficiencies. Those words are striking because they cut against the typical language of rulers. Monarchs speak of destiny, divine right, or heroic certainty. Washington spoke of burden, difficulty, and inadequacy. That posture, publicly acknowledging the weight of responsibility, helped set the tone for a presidency that was meant to be accountable. It also signaled that Washington did not see himself as a national savior. He saw himself as a temporary steward. In a young nation full of people nervous about concentrated power, that tone was not merely personal, it was strategic. It encouraged Americans to trust the office without worshiping the man. Of course, Washington was not naive. He knew that Republican government depends on virtue, and that virtue is unevenly distributed. He also knew that factions could become poisonous. By his second term, he watched party politics harden, and he grew deeply frustrated by the way partisan conflict could make Americans think of each other as enemies. He wanted unity, not because he expected everyone to agree on every policy, but because he feared that the habit of faction could invite foreign manipulation and domestic instability. Yet here again, Washington's refusal to be king showed itself as a discipline. He did not respond to faction by trying to abolish politics, silence opponents, or rule through personal authority. That is how would-be monarchs respond. They claim that disagreement is dangerous, therefore they must be obeyed. Washington tolerated disagreement while warning against its excesses. He tried to guide rather than dominate. He hoped the system would be stronger than personalities, including his own. When Washington refused a third term, he made perhaps his most influential contribution to American political culture. The nation was still fragile. People feared change. Many believed Washington's personal prestige was the glue holding the Union together. In that context, stepping down could seem reckless. Yet he understood a brutal truth. If the republic could not survive without him, then it was not truly a republic. It would be an elected monarchy, a state that pretended to be governed by law but was actually governed by dependence on one man's character. Washington chose to make the republic prove itself. He forced the country to practice peaceful transition. He forced Americans to accept that leadership is temporary, and he made it psychologically possible for citizens to respect a president without needing him forever. That decision also sent a message beyond America's shores. European powers did not simply watch American battles, they watched American habits. They wanted to know what kind of nation this would become. A victorious general turned king would have been easy to understand, easy to predict, easy to manage diplomatically. A republic where the most famous man willingly stepped aside was a different kind of animal. It suggested that the United States might have staying power not because it had a dynasty, but because it had institutions. In a world where monarchy was the default, Washington's resignation from power looked almost unnatural, like a man refusing gravity. That is why the gesture echoed far beyond American borders. It was not just a domestic precedent. It was a challenge to the assumptions of the age. Then, after all that public service, Washington returned again to Mount Vernon. This return is often described as retreat, but for Washington it was also fulfillment. He valued private life. He valued work. He valued the dignity of being a citizen rather than a ruler. He had seen enough of politics to know its corrosion, the way it can tempt men into manipulation, vanity, and endless self-justification. Yet even in private life, he remained a national symbol, and symbols can become dangerous in a republic if they are used to excuse fanatic loyalty. Washington's greatness is that his symbol worked the other way. His symbol was not "follow me forever." His symbol was "build something that outlasts me." Washington had no biological children, and yet he became known as the father of his country. The phrase can sound like hero worship, but it also captures a deeper truth about founding moments. Nations are not born fully formed. They are assembled from ideas, habits, compromises, and examples. Washington gave the United States one of its most important examples, that the man who holds the sword must not hold the crown, that the man who could take everything must sometimes take nothing, that the leader who is trusted must prove his trustworthiness by submitting to limits. In that sense, fatherhood is not merely about producing heirs. It is about setting a pattern. Washington's pattern was restraint. Even the way the world reacted to his death in 1799 reflects the unique nature of his legacy. At his death, the British Channel Fleet fired a 20-gun salute in his honor, remembering a valiant former enemy. That kind of tribute is not common. Nations rarely honor those who humiliated them. But Washington had become larger than the conflict because his character represented something the world could respect even across political divides: courage without cruelty, authority without lust for domination, victory without the appetite for permanent rule. The salute was an acknowledgement that Washington had not been a mere rebel. He had been a statesman in uniform, a man who fought with the discipline of a soldier and then acted with the self-control of a citizen. Now bring the camera back to the emotional heart of your video title. George Washington, the man who refused to be king. The power of that title is that it contains a choice. It implies there was an alternative path, and there was. America could have emerged from the Revolution as a monarchy. Maybe it would have been called something else at first: protector, president for life, chief magistrate with extraordinary powers. But the essence would have been the same: a state centered on one man's permanence. Many countries have followed that path even in modern times because it is tempting and because it offers simple answers to complex problems. Washington's refusal did not guarantee that America would be perfect. It did not erase conflict, prevent injustice, or eliminate future crises. What it did do was establish the principle that solutions should be sought through law and civic responsibility rather than through personal rule. There is a reason Americans continue to return to Washington in their imagination when they argue about leadership. His life offers a kind of measuring stick. Not just was he effective, but was he restrained? Many leaders can be effective for a season by concentrating power. Many leaders can win battles by commanding obedience. But the American question has always been whether effectiveness can be achieved without surrendering liberty, whether unity can be achieved without worship, whether government can be strong without becoming a throne. Washington did not solve that puzzle once and for all, but he gave the nation a starting answer. You build strength through institutions, and you protect liberty through limits, and you prove your devotion to the people not by how much you rule, but by whether you are willing to stop ruling. So if you want your viewers to feel proud, do not only show Washington as a warrior on horseback, though he was that. Show him as a man standing at the edge of absolute power and stepping back. Show him as a man who could have made history by taking a crown, but chose instead to make history by refusing it. In a way, that refusal is the most American act imaginable, because it insists that the nation belongs not to a king, not to a general, not to a party, and not to a single generation of founders, but to the people who inherit it and the principles that govern it. The Revolution was fought with muskets, but the Republic was secured with something rarer: self-control. And that is the final thunderclap to leave echoing in your audience's mind. George Washington did not become great because he had power. Plenty of men have power. He became great because, when he had the chance to make himself permanent, he chose to make the Republic permanent instead. He refused to be king so that Americans would never have to bow, not to him, not to anyone, and could stand upright as citizens of a nation built on consent. That is not just a chapter of history. It is a national inheritance, and it is a